Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to the World Affairs Council's Foreign Policy Panel Series discussion on Syria after Assad. I'm Heidi Shoup, and on behalf of the board and members of the Council, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. 2 years ago, during the wider Middle Eastern protest movement that became known as the Arab Spring, demonstrations began in Syria. Protesters demanded the resignation of President Bashar al-Assad, whose family had held the presidency there since 1971, as well as the end of the Ba'ath Party rule. This grew into an ongoing armed conflict between forces loyal to the Syrian Ba'ath Party government and those seeking to oust it. Over the course of the last 2 years, it seems that just about every player in the Middle East political landscape has become involved in events in Syria, from the Emir of Qatar to Hezbollah, from Russia, and increasingly, it appears, to the United States. Feelings are high all across the political spectrum, and I think our speakers this evening will help us understand the various forces at play in Syria today, and perhaps also give us some perspective on the consequences, intended and otherwise, of the possible scenarios we have before us. We have 3 distinguished speakers: Stuart W. Bowen, Jr., Ambassador Ted Kattouf, and Dr. Daniel Serwer. And I welcome you all and thank you all for being with us this evening. Our moderator is Dr. Daniel Serwer, Senior Research Professor of Conflict Management and a Senior Fellow at the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He served as Vice President for Peace and Stability Operations and then as Vice President at the United States Institute of Peace from 1998 until 2010. He also served as U.S. Special Envoy for the Bosnian Federation and as Minister Counsel at the United States Department of State. He will introduce the panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. Dr. Serwer.
Heidi, am I allowed to sit here?
You certainly are.
Okay, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening, even if the subject is an extraordinarily difficult one. I've just come, in fact, from speaking with some of the folks at the Syrian Opposition Coalition, I think is the Washington short version of its title. And I can tell you that whatever the president decided the other day and Ben Rhodes announced, things are still very unclear, and they're not a whole lot clearer as a result of the conversation between Presidents Obama and Putin either. This is a moving target that we're talking about, but we have 2 extraordinary speakers to try to aim at that moving target. I'm not going to read their bios to you because you have them. But I do like to say a personal word or two about the speakers. Stuart Bowen, if you haven't read his Hard Lessons book done by SIGIR, I won't say it's done only by Stuart, it's an extraordinary document, and I'm looking forward to reading his latest Learning from Iraq. He has really done something which is quite extraordinary and not at all the usual kind of thing in trying to have both a micro and a macro approach to being the Inspector General. Usually the Inspector General, he checks the receipts and arrests people who don't deliver them properly. He's done that work. They have to do that work. The 86 convictions for fraud and other crimes, one of them is somebody who worked for me. So he's done that work, and he's done it well. But he's also done the macro picture, and I expect to get some of that from him tonight in looking forward to post-Assad Syria. Ted Kattouf has had an extraordinary career in the State Department. I'll just read quickly his postings because they are marvelous. Kuwait, Damascus, Princeton. Princeton's important. I got my PhD there. Baghdad, Sana'a, Damascus. DCM, Riyadh, ambassador in the UAE, ambassador in Syria. 3 tours in Syria, which is, I don't know, a lot of people who've served more than that in Damascus. I have a personal story about Ted that he may not even remember, and that is that I tried to, when I was deputy chief of mission in Rome, I tried to recruit him to come as the political minister counselor, and he preferred going as DCM in Damascus.
What was I thinking?
Well, all things considered, I've got to say I think you thought rather well. Ted, will you start us off?
Sure. Let me just say at the outset that many people that I respect are on different sides of the issue of what the U.S. should or should not be doing in Syria. And I think that's important to keep in mind. I think it's also important to keep in mind that these very same people often share the same analysis. Excuse me, let me rephrase that. They basically agree on the facts to a large extent about what's going on in Syria and in neighboring countries. And yes, their analysis to some extent are the same. For instance, when the president announced that we were going to start supplying arms to elements of the Free Syrian Army, both those who were for it and those who were against it said it's not going to make that much difference on the ground. It's not enough. It's too little, too late at the moment to be making much of a difference. So I think as I go through my points, it's important to keep that in mind because I do have respect for so many people who might disagree with my position. I think we first have to ask ourselves, okay, how did Bashar al-Assad get to where he was, other than being born into the family business? And he's from a minority group, the Alawites, believed to make up 12% of the Syrian population. Historically, particularly in Ottoman times, which weren't really all that long ago, historically speaking, the Alawites were a very heterodox offshoot of Shia Islam, very downtrodden, very despised people, very discriminated against, lived in the coastal mountains of Syria, above Latakia and Tartus. The French, with their sort of divide and conquer tactics, recognized that the Alawites could be useful to them, and they recruited a lot of them into the colonial gendarmerie. A lot of Alawite young people saw that this was, or young men saw that this was a ladder that had been extended to them, and they started to climb it within the military. Even at that time, they only could be non-commissioned officers. Sunnis, particularly urban Sunnis, thought it was a rather shameful thing to be in that force, and they tended not to join so much. So after independence in 1945, the Alawites gradually came to dominate the officer corps. So by the time that Assad made a coup against a fellow named Salah Jadid, you basically had one faction of Alawites within the military wing of the Ba'ath Party contesting leadership with another group of Ba'athis from the who were Alawite. When Assad prevailed, he kept his grip on power, obviously, had competing intelligence services, security services, promoted his loyalists to positions of great trust and responsibility, ensured that there was enough corruption going on that A, he could make book on them, so that if they ever got out of line, he could take care of them, but B, that if not, they were well taken care of. It was very much a mafia regime, and it remains so under Bashar al-Assad, who came to power at the I guess, June of 2000 when his father passed. It was a secular, because the Alawites are not a mainstream Islamic group. They were understandably very secular in their approach to governing. Religious minorities were protected. Everybody could worship as they pleased as long as they didn't pose any kind of a political threat to the regime. And compared with maybe some of the conservatism of the Gulf and all, they tended to be a little more liberal where women's issues and the like were concerned. Bashar was not the heir apparent. His brother Basil, who had wanted a military career, was the heir apparent to the father. Basil got killed in an automobile accident in the early 1990s, and Bashar, who had only been briefly doing a medical residency in London, was recalled and asked by his father if he wanted to assume that mantle, and he says that he agreed. It wasn't forced upon him. So Bashar learned very much from his father. I think he was quite misunderstood both by foreigners and many Syrians when he first came to power, because they believed he was a true reformer and he wanted to change things, and he gave that impression. But really, he just wanted to do more or less administrative reform within the government and within the Ba'ath Party and the like. And even the mild reforms he tried were discouraged by those retainers who were still around from the old man's days. Fast forward to March 2011, despite what had happened in Tunisia and what had happened in Egypt and in Yemen, Bashar didn't see the uprising coming. He gave an interview just about 6 weeks before the uprising in Dara began to the Wall Street Journal, in which he said rather pompously that his people weren't ready for democracy. They didn't really understand how a country was to be governed and the like, and they needed dialogue, long dialogue and education and the like before they would be ready for anything that looked too much like a Western style democracy. You know much of the story of what happened. Demonstrators came out against the regime, first in the southern market town of Dara near the Jordanian border, later in the bigger city of Homs, north of Damascus. And Bashar took a page from his father's playbook and had the demonstrators beaten, shot, arrested, tortured. Often then they would be released so that others could see how they had been, how badly they had been mistreated and how much they had suffered in incarceration and the like, presumably so that families would not permit their young people to go out in the streets. They wouldn't go out in the streets. But contrary to all expectations within the regime, and indeed, I think the expectations of many people like myself who'd followed Syria for many years, people did come into the streets day after day after day, despite the depredations of the regime, despite the killings, despite the torture. It was quite spectacular, quite an amazing show of courage and disgust with the regime. But that kind of a peaceful protest probably couldn't last under that kind of pressure. And you could argue that in maybe one respect, if Bashar couldn't intimidate people from coming out into the streets, then he wanted to be able to say, look how violent they are, look how much they are influenced by external jihadists and the like. And he more or less got his wish. Maybe he probably got a lot more than he bargained for. And the opposition did, for the most part, turn violent. Not all the opposition. Indeed, there are still to this day people within the opposition who say this is a big mistake. We shouldn't have succumbed to a scenario which Bashar himself might have, to some extent, wanted. We've sacrificed the overwhelming international sympathy that we had, but as other Syrians would point out, sympathy only gets you so far. when your young people are getting killed in the streets. And as time went on, and as the regime bombed and used artillery and mortars and tank fire on people, as you've seen in places like Homs and the like, the opposition got more and more radicalized. And jihadis actually did come in from outside. The opposition was very decentralized, very localized all over Syria. Often those who had the best training, the best sources of arms and funding, those who could distribute food to people and the like, often did turn out to be some of the most radical groups that were fighting the Assad regime. And rather than speaking in terms of democracy and liberalism and human rights and the like, they spoke more in religious terms and in terms of more in terms of what Salafi groups wanted, more in terms, one group, of course, Jabhat al-Nusra, famously said, "We are Al-Qaeda. We are Al-Qaeda in Syria." And there's a power struggle going on even now within that group between the commander of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who wants to also dominate Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and the local commander. So it's no longer, if it ever was, a black and white picture. There are horrible things being perpetrated by forces on both sides. Assad and his forces still, I think, win hands down in terms of atrocities, if not least because they have the airplanes, they have the tanks, and the opposition doesn't. So now we have increasingly a civil war in Syria in which there is growing sectarian overtones, growing sectarian hatreds, and an increasingly existential struggle wherein both sides believe, each side believes that if they lose to the other, it's going to be, they're virtually going to lose everything, including their lives and their family honor and the like. And the tension, it's more than the tension. The war is spilling over into Lebanon and Iraq. Both countries also have makeups not so dissimilar from that of Syria. The percentages are different. For instance, the Shia are the majority in Iraq. The Sunnis are the minority in Iraq. But you have Kurds and you have Christians in Iraq, just like you have Syria. Lebanon has no majority population according to religion. The Shiites are the plurality, but you have a large Sunni population and significant Christian minorities, as well as Druze and others. So these tensions are building up, and now Hezbollah, after clandestinely sending, it was pretty much an open secret that they were sending some of their fighters from South Lebanon to help Assad in Syria with Iran's approval and support. But now it's overt, it's out there. The leader of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, has said, we're not going to let Assad lose. That's not going to happen as long as we have anything to do with it. So you have Hezbollah fighters coming across from Lebanon to fight for Assad, as we saw recently in this major battle near the city of Homs at a crossroads called Qusair, a village or a city called Qusair, which controls some key roads between the city of Homs and the coast, which the Alawites tend to dominate. And you have Sunnis coming across from places like Tripoli and the Bekaa Valley to fight for the opposition. And you have to ask yourself, how long are they going to be able to continue fighting one another in Syria without full-scale fighting breaking out among them in Lebanon? And indeed, in the northern Lebanese city of Tripoli, you have a huge neighborhood of Alawites who sit on top of a large promontory in the city, fighting their Sunni neighbors who are much more populous down below. Already there are 100,000 dead, 4 or 5 million people displaced from their homes, a tremendous humanitarian crisis. After forswearing intervention for obviously more than 2 years. The current administration in Washington, the Obama administration, has announced that we believe that there were a few instances in which the regime used chemical weapons in battles in Aleppo and in the near Damascus, with maybe 100 to 150 people killed by those weapons. The president had said that's a red line, and he had Ben Rhodes come out and announce that, well, because this red line was crossed, we're now going to start helping the opposition militarily, and there's a lot of reports that the arms will be funneled, the ammunition through the CIA, and training will be given to those groups among the Free Syrian Army who've been vetted and are believed not to have sympathies towards Al-Qaeda or other radical jihadi groups. But as I said at the outset, it's not at all clear that this is going to make a real difference on the ground. The administration has not been very vocal about what its strategy is, but they did call for Assad's ouster a long time ago without saying how they hope to accomplish that. And some people would say, well, maybe that was a mistake, because if you're a superpower, you shouldn't really be announcing that you want a leader out if you don't have a plan in place to make that happen in a reasonable period of time. What the administration has never said, however, is that we want a disbandment of the Syrian army as occurred in Iraq after the invasion. And I think that's obviously very significant. So what I think the administration's real policy is, I think they're aiming for exhaustion, particularly on the part of the regime. I mean, there are far more Sunnis in Syria than there are Alawites in the army. And I think they would like to see the opposition be able to continue to hold much of the territory it currently holds, keep the pressure on the regime to the point in which senior elements in the military said this isn't working. You know, Bashar can never be president of all of Syria again. We have to cut a deal in the interests of our communities and our families and the like, and come up with some power sharing arrangement and some guarantee for individual rights in this country until there can be elections and a democratic government. And we have to try to help the opposition isolate the jihadists among them, even as we get rid of the extremists among us. That's an awfully small needle to try to thread, and I'm not sure, I don't think we're very good at this. And I don't think this is any type of easy undertaking. The war in Lebanon, in one form or another, went on for 15 years, from 1975 to 1990. Finally, they did get exhausted. Much of the country had been destroyed, and they came up with the slogan, "No victor, no vanquished." But to this day, you don't have a really great functioning democracy in Lebanon. I fear that even if Bashar is killed or goes into exile, we're more likely to see a continuation of the war in other forms, with maybe warlordism in a failed state occurring, wherein there are one or more Alawite factions within the army who carve out fiefdoms for themselves, and that the opposition starts fighting among itself as well for who's going to control Syria. So I'm not optimistic about all of this. I do think it's a slippery slope. And I fear that the Syria is the kind of place where you could see Srebrenicas and the like. We must keep in mind that in Lebanon in 1982, we got behind Israel's desire to get the PLO out of Lebanon. Israelis said they wouldn't withdraw unless the PLO did get out of Lebanon. We put U.S. Marines ashore to help supervise the evacuation of PLO forces. Massacres occurred in Sabra and Shatila. We sent the Marines back in, and not very long thereafter, forces that were the forerunner, perhaps, of Hezbollah and elements of the IRGC, killed 241 of our Marines. Reagan spoke tough, but he withdrew the American forces, and we really didn't suffer. The idea, oh, our prestige is ruined, nobody will ever deal with this again. I don't recall that happening. So I think I'll leave it there with that cautionary.
Thank you very much, Ted. Stuart?
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Heidi, and the World Affairs Council for having this panel and inviting me. And honored to be on the panel with Ted and Dan, and thanks to all of you for being here as well. 3 things I want to talk to you about tonight in my brief remarks. 1, what are the top 3 lessons that we learned from Iraq that are applicable to Syria? 2, how are we structured today to engage in Syria after Assad, the title of this talk, and it'll probably be complete. There ought to be a question mark at the end of that title, I think, whether there will be an after an Assad, and then if after Assad, what do we do? And I think it's, of course, something along the lines of a stabilization and reconstruction operation, and I'll give you a good overview about how we are structured to accomplish such. And then third, what we need to do, frankly, because the answer in my second point will be we're not well structured. We need to reform, and we need to do it fast and soon if it's going to be applicable to Syria after Assad. But let me begin by responding to a couple of things Ted said of note, and that is a gentleman named al-Baghdadi, who is the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or ostensible head of whatever Al-Qaeda in Iraq looks like, a collection of terrorist groups under his leadership and ultimately under Zawahiri, is competing with al-Golani in Syria now for leadership of the Al-Qaeda aspect, fairly dominant aspect of al-Nusra, the al-Nusra front. And that ought to be the most chilling point that you take away from tonight, because they are chanting, as I've been told, I'm sure you've heard, Ted, Damascus today, Baghdad tomorrow. And you've seen the last 2 months the news from Iraq. It's not been good, it's been horrible. The worst 2 months in 5 years, which breaks my heart. I've been to Iraq 34 times in the last 9 years, and I've seen the entire sine curve of experience from the horrible years of 2005 to 2007, the recovery in 2008, and the gradual peacemaking after that. But here you see in the west, that's Anbar province. That's the part of Iraq you see. Ted, when he was in Iraq in the mid-'80s, I'm sure went out there a lot. I've been to Fallujah and Ramadi, the 2 largest Sunni cities in Iraq, along with Mosul. And they were pacified in 2008, 2009 through something called the Sons of Iraq program. That pacification has been lost. That's what the last 2 months tell you. And the fact is no thanks to Maliki, 2 mistakes he's made, I think, in the last 6 months have been the oppression of moderate Sunnis, and the arrest warrant issued for his Minister of Finance, Rafi al-Assawi, someone who I got to know, a good man, a reasonable man, a doctor from Fallujah, not a Ba'athist, wasn't even in the government, are now living on a compound in Ramadi with Abu Risha, the leader of the Sunni tribes in Anbar. All of them looking west to what's going on in Syria. Many of them moving west to participate in what's going on in Syria. All of them with allegiance to al-Baghdadi. That is my biggest concern, because Syria after Assad, exclamation point, means that blowback from Damascus towards Baghdad will be lethal. And what we haven't lost from the $60 billion that we invested in Iraq and the work of the last 10 years will begin to be lost at that stage. So that's my that's a grim opener, but it's something to think about with regard to what's going on in the context of the effects, not just of the 100,000 deaths in Syria and the collapse of the country over the last 2.5 years, but the fact that this is a regional challenge, a regional maelstrom that could swallow up so much of what we hope for, peace, stability, an Arab Spring that makes progress. That's not what we're seeing erupting in Syria now and in Anbar. So 3 lessons from Iraq quickly. Learning from Iraq lays out 7 at the end. We have some books here that for afterwards that you can pick up. If you don't get one, email me, stuartbowen2@yahoo.com. I'll mail one to you. But the 3 lessons are, 1, we need to develop an integrated capacity to plan, execute, and oversee stabilization and reconstruction operations. An entity that actually has that as a primary duty, not as additional duty, which is the current case throughout our government. 2, don't do major rebuilding operations. And again, you'll say, why is this a lesson, as many have said, when it's a very violent setting? Yes, obvious, but the realities, the activities, the experiences from Iraq force that lesson upon us, and we better take it if we engage in Syria with us. 3, develop some uniformity in your approach to executing stabilization and reconstruction operations. This comes from our auditing. 390 audits and inspections we produced, and what I learned over and over again was a complete lack of uniformity among the agencies. Chapter 2 is worth reading. It's 44 interviews I did with senior Iraqis, senior U.S. officials, but I referred because Claire McCaskill, senator from Missouri's statement to me about how we managed Iraq was it was a circular firing squad among the interagency. Chris Hill, the ambassador in Iraq in 2010, said it was a bureaucratic culture war between state and defense. You know, these are honest, sobering comments, but they ought to be more than just reportage. They ought to be clarion calls to reform. And what that means is a reform that brings uniformity to how we contract. Because as I learned, I didn't know this before I got into this business, each agency was in Iraq using a different form of the Federal Acquisition Regulation. How does a contractor supposed to respond to that when the money's all mixed and you're trying to, and the target's constantly moving, and you're having to deal in the minutiae of this particular agency's amended FAR? Fix that with a contingency Federal Acquisition Regulation, which is our recommendation. So, find an integrated capacity. Don't build under fire, big stuff. And make some sense of what you're doing by setting a set of rules that everyone follows, an IT system that tracks everything you're building. We didn't have that in Iraq. Our audit showed we tracked only 70%. Outrageous, not unacceptable. And as the Iraqis told me repeatedly in my interviews, you were the United States, we expected more. All right, so those are lessons. How are we structured to do stabilization and reconstruction operations today? Not very well. As a matter of fact, I would say we're not significantly better off than we were 10 years ago when we went into Iraq. And that should be a troubling thought for each of you. There are 5 entities in the government that have a piece of this mission. The new one is at the Department of Defense. In 2005, Secretary Rumsfeld signed a directive called 3000.01, DOD Directive 3000. It created stabilization operations as a mission of the Army. So Army does offensive, defensive, and stabilization operations. It's in the field manual now. And how they do it is still a huge question mark, and how it interweaves with the civilian side, an even bigger question, because these should be civilian-led, but where's the capacity? We say in Learning from Iraq, 80% of the contracts were DOD contracts. Who's in charge? Follow the money. That needs to be fixed. But the civilian expeditionary workforce is a DOD entity with a lot of people in Afghanistan now, and if we engage in a stabilization operation in Syria, they'll be there. That's 1. 2, a new bureau led by my friend Rick Barton, just the right guy to lead it, smart and capable person to help me write hard lessons, is called the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. The challenge is it's new, it's not significantly funded, it's not really planning for this. They're doing good work in Belize, suppressing gangs, and in Honduras, helping the judiciary, and in Kenya, supporting elections, and some sort of quiet work in Syria, aid, sort of low-level aid work. But is it ready to carry out a stabilization and reconstruction operation? Are they planning for it? Are they planning for? Have they established the doctrine, the interagency doctrine, the contracting capacity, the IT capacity, the personnel rules, the oversight? And the answer is no. We've been active around the world in stabilization operations, but we haven't learned this big lesson, that we need integration, not coordination on the ground. And that's what my third point is. I propose in Chapter 6 here the creation of such an entity. Occam's razor. If no one's in charge, create an entity where someone is in charge, right? Create accountability. At least Mike Brown was there to be fired, right? When FEMA fell in 2005. There's no such accountability with regard to what's happened in Iraq or Afghanistan, for that matter, which, by the way, is Iraq 60 billion, Afghanistan 100 billion, and climbing, going to be 120 before you know it. What I propose in Chapter 6 is create the U.S. Office for Contingency Operations that brings these missions together, gives a responsibility to somebody, and for $25 million a year, you can have this entity that will actually integrate all of these scattered pieces, these stovepipes, knock down these stovepipes, and bring under the chief of mission. So you have someone actually under the chief of mission who has done the planning before we get there, and I think that's the key piece. In Iraq, the planning was done in Iraq. In Afghanistan, the planning was done in Afghanistan. We ought to plan before it happens, before the balloon goes up. That's also pretty self-evident. It's in the military DNA. It's not in the civilian DNA. These missions are not defense. They're not diplomacy. They're not development. They're a hybrid. They're the fourth D, I call it. And no one has this as their primary duty. To use the military term, it's an additional duty for all these agencies. And until we are clear about who's in charge, you're going to keep asking, when these operations unfold, who's in charge? And if this happens again in Syria, we have no one to blame but ourselves. So there is, and I'll close on a slightly higher note than that, and it is that there is the possibility that this could come to be. There is interest on Capitol Hill for implementing such a reform, and the potential for legislation is present. And so with that, again, thank you. Pleasure to be here, and look forward to questions.
Thank you, Stuart. I find myself in radical sympathy with both speakers. Seems to me that what Ted has told us is that this is going to be a very difficult situation. Whatever happens after Assad is not going to be pretty and neat and tied up in a bow. It's going to be a mess. And it's going to be difficult. It's going to be expensive. The number of 100 billion comes to my mind for sure. I claim the credit for having predicted almost to the dollar how much the United States would spend in the first 3 years after the war in Bosnia on Bosnian reconstruction. It was a pure guess, by the way.
What was it? How much?
It was $3 billion. This is going to be a messy situation. And I got to tell you, what Ted said about the slippery slope is true. This is a slippery slope, and this President of the United States is very, very cautious about the slippery slope. He sees that this is going to be hard and expensive. He doesn't want to break Syria because he doesn't want to buy Syria. And, there might be some considerable sympathy among the citizens for that perspective as well. And Stuart is absolutely correct about what's required in these situations. There's no better person to address the lessons learned. The problem is that presidents don't want to do this. I can tell you that since 1989, U.S. troops have been in conflict zones trying to do nation building every single year since 1989. Yet every single president since 1989 has resisted doing nation building. Even President George H.W. Bush sent the troops, the Marines, into Somalia first, not for nation building, but to feed people. And he thought, we'll feed people, then we'll get out. Well, that's not possible. And if you look at each and every president since President Clinton, I know my friends at the Cato Institute tell me that Clinton threw himself with abandon into Bosnia, but that's not true. He waited 3.5 years into his first term while Bosnia was going to hell in a handbasket before intervening, and then promised the Congress that after our deployment that we would be out within a year, even though any intelligent person on earth knew that that wasn't true. The resistance to going into Kosovo is strong. The resistance, Iraq is perhaps the exception, but I've got to say that both in Afghanistan and Iraq, the estimate of the president was that this was going to be relatively easy and relatively cheap. It was, in fact, easy. I got news for you. In Afghanistan, it was easy, and it was not much more than a month before the Taliban were out of there. And even in Baghdad, people forget this, but it's true, even in Iraq, the troops were welcomed initially. The problem is that you can't get out so easy. So presidents don't want to do it, so they don't prepare for it, they don't integrate, they don't plan, and so we're unprepared for the next time around. It's rather extraordinary, but Stuart and I discussed this earlier. We are not much better prepared to do a major stabilization operation today than we were when I went into Bosnia for the first time in 1994. One of the first American Foreign Service officers in 20 years to hear guns fired in anger. We've now got Foreign Service officers deployed in conflict zones all the time. So with that comment, I want to ask Ted first. Your skepticism is clear. But I wonder if I can ask you, as a good Foreign Service officer, to make the argument for why we should engage in Syria and why we should be prepared for the post-conflict operation.
Sure. No, that's not. Look, there are a lot of good people in the opposition. There are a lot of intellectuals. You'll meet some of them around Washington. They're some of the finest people you could ever hope to know. They're real small d Democrats. They want a new era in Syria. They want a different kind of polity. They recognize their country has stagnated all these decades and the like. And you have many brave Syrians who are fighting in the Free Syrian Army, or at least under the umbrella of these Free Syrian Army, because these groups tend not to be all that well coordinated. Again, who want something different, something better. They might not be able to always articulate it, but they've had enough of the dictatorship, just like we've seen elsewhere in the Middle East, and they want their dignity, and they want their rights, and they want their kids to have opportunities and a decent education. And they feel abandoned, and they feel like nobody is coming to help them. That they were unfortunate in their timing or something, that nobody, Libya got help, for God's sakes, but Syria's not getting help, and they don't understand it. And the case to be made is that if we don't build up the Free Syrian Army, then they will either find themselves under the thumb of the radical groups, or if they do go into a fight with the radical groups, they will decisively lose it. And Assad will be replaced, a mafia-like dictatorship will then be replaced by a jihadist, anti-American, troublemaking regime that's bad for Jordan, bad for Israel, bad for everybody in the neighborhood, and undoes everything that we tried to do in Iraq. And meanwhile, Syria is a surrogate, or Syria is now a junior partner to Iran, and Iran and Hezbollah will appear to come out the winners in all of this.
Stuart, you want to do this right next time, but what do you say to the skeptic who says, look, it's true, Treasury does a good job on macroeconomic policy. There's a good paper prepared at USIP, by the way, on the subject as well, on the Treasury advisors. And there's a magnificent part of Francis Fukuyama's book on state building that is well worth reading because it explains how much easier macroeconomic policy is to get right than a police force. Because a police force requires a very large number of people to behave in the correct manner. And training them to do that is difficult, but also measuring the degree to which they comply or not is extremely difficult. Whereas in the macroeconomy, if you get it wrong, you know it right away. I mean, there's too much money around, there's inflation, and you got to correct for it. So, okay, yeah, there are some things we can help people with. We should help people with them. But you're not going to have Americans in large numbers on the ground in Syria after this. Shouldn't somebody else be doing this? Why is it us?
Well, it should be multilateral. And I think one of the things that would come from creating USOCO is to give a center of gravity for multilateral connection. I get international agencies, and actually other countries are ahead of us in creating an integrated capacity, like the Stabilization Unit in UK, calling me because they've read some of our work, and I say, no, I'm an IG. Actually, we're just making recommendations. Well, then they say, who do we call? I say, well, I got a long list of numbers you can call, to try and find out what it is different people are doing. That's the problem. There is no center of gravity. There's no belly button for stabilization and reconstruction operations in the country. Treasury does a great job, but there ought to be somebody coordinating all the planning now. Actually, should have started a year ago, and we have the info, we have the intel. DOD has, we know about collection, right? There's a lot of collection going on, and there's certainly plenty of collection over there about the status of the power plants in Syria, the dilapidated, virtually destroyed oil system, the housing, everything. And here's what somebody should be doing, though. Prioritizing what should be done from day one. There ought to be a plan, just like there is at the military with regard to kinetic operations. We don't start planning once the war starts. We shouldn't start the stabilization operation once the war stops. We ought to have that plan in place. People ought to know what they're going to do. There ought to be someone in charge. There ought to be accountability and transparency. And there ought to be someone, I think, saying these three things. You've got to start with the rule of law. That's the first building block to lay in a stabilization operation. We've learned that from Iraq. We've learned that from Afghanistan. We've learned that everywhere, frankly. And you've got to begin with creating security so families can feel somewhat safe in their homes when they aren't usually in the first phase, post-conflict, phase 4, the military calls it. Second, you need to have the financial system stabilized, because that's the foundation of the economy. And I think Treasury does that, but you ought to be planning in an integrated fashion with everybody about how we're going to go in and how this will unfold. And third, I think electricity's got to happen. You've got to get the grid back up, because the entire system depends on at least a marginally reliable power supply. But that's me just talking about it. Is there anybody in charge of planning for Syria that's saying these kinds of things in some room somewhere, some basement across town? And the answer is no, not right now. And there is planning. It's not like there's none going on, but there's no integrated capacity. That's what USOCO would do.
Thank you. I just want to add one word because it hasn't been mentioned. The map behind me shows you where Syria is, and in particular shows you Syria's neighbors. And to me, one of the main reasons that argues in favor of American engagement in Syria comes from this map. Because if we allow things to continue in the direction in which they've been going, as Ted mentioned, Lebanon gets destabilized. As Stuart mentioned, Iraq gets destabilized. Turkey is at risk. Jordan is at risk. This is fortunately not the oil-rich part of the Middle East. Iraq's oil, its main oil deposits lie far to the south, and its oil goes out through the Strait of Hormuz, which is not such a great idea, I think, but in this situation, it's a good idea because it keeps it out of the range of the Syrian war and the overflow from the Syrian war. These states are, in some sense, artificial states. They were created in relatively recent times. At least the lines were drawn. They all have some prior existence, but the lines were drawn fairly recently. You could see the state structures throughout the Levant collapsing. What is Al-Qaeda's goal? Al-Qaeda's goal is the recreation of the caliphate.
Right.
And in order to do that, what do you have to do? You have to collapse the state structures. And Stuart mentioned the chant, Damascus today, Baghdad tomorrow. From our terrorist enemies' point of view, this is an important theater of operations.
Exactly.
And to ignore it completely and hope that it will go away, that it won't come back and bite us, is, I think, to make a big mistake. Exactly what we should do about it is another question, but to ignore it completely is a big mistake. With that, I'm going to open the floor to questions, please.
I'd be interested in your observation about the Putin-Obama dilemma and the fact that Mr. Putin is putting missiles in to shoot down our no-fly zone.
Yeah, just a quick comment first. Apparently the Syrians have not received the S-300 missiles as of yet, despite what Bashar has claimed. But yeah, Putin has been a brake on us and on the West all along where the crisis in Syria is concerned. Obviously, they have a veto in the UN Security Council. Daniel would know this far better than I. I'm not a Russian expert, but I believe that the Russians, and particularly Putin, as a former good KGB man, believes that Yeltsin was taken advantage of by the West during the whole Balkans crisis, and that their ally Serbia got a raw deal. And in Libya, they believe that we went far beyond the UN Security Council resolutions they voted for. And Putin is determined to show his people that he's standing up for Russian interests. And it's a big problem for the Obama administration because the bigger issues out there are Iran, at least for the moment, and North Korea. And we saw in 2008 the mischief that Russia can do. In Georgia, for instance, when they've helped the breakaway provinces of Georgia, of Abkhazia, and I'll forget the other one, but anyway, there are two of them. South Ossetia or Ossetia, and so as I think George Will once said in a column, China and Russia are the last upholders of the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648. They believe in absolute state sovereignty and non-interference, and they're determined to drive that home.
Maybe I can add a word. I think whether Putin is in charge doesn't depend on the communique from the G20. It depends on what the president decides to do now. I think the administration was purposely ambiguous before the G8 meeting about what decisions the president was making, because they wanted to see if they could get the Russians to stand down. They want the minimum escalation. From all reports, they got nothing from Putin. So the president now has this difficult decision. Do I turn on the tap, let the weapons flow, knowing full well that some of them will get to the wrong people and may do some very bad things, and making the situation worse in Syria, at least for a while? This is not an easy decision to make, and I expect him to come back and deliberate a bit before he actually makes it. It's what we pay him the big bucks for, and we'll just have to wait and see, I think, what he does. This I can be pretty sure of, that there can be no successful negotiation unless the military situation on the ground in Syria is more equilibrated than it is today.
I have two questions. First, the U.S. continually states that the best outcome is a negotiated political settlement. Do you see this as a possibility in the next few years? Are we going to see a political settlement emerge, especially with Iran and Hezbollah throwing their full weight behind Assad? Will he willfully leave power? And secondly, after the conflict, what can and should the U.S. role be in protecting against revenge killings?
Ted?
Well, as I think I said earlier, if I had to guess at what the administration's strategy is, based on what I've seen, what I've heard, I think it's the belief that if we can get something of a stalemate with maybe the balance of power tipped towards the opposition rather than the Alawite-dominated army, there is a chance for a negotiated settlement. But unfortunately, in these kind of wars, it seems like they have to, you have to try, both sides have to try every other option before they sit down with one another out of sheer exhaustion and sheer suffering and desperation and negotiate. So could I see a negotiation succeeding in a few years? Yeah, but I could also see this thing going on far beyond the next few years. And the thing that I fear most is the scenario that you mentioned, boots on the ground, that we have to send in, or somebody has to send in forces because one side or the other has essentially won, and now they're massacring on a much larger scale their enemies or their perceived enemies.
Stuart?
Well, we did run into that exhaustion in Iraq. In 2006, something called the Awakening Movement actually preceded the Sons of Iraq program. We spent $370 million paying 99,000 Sunnis not to fight for 3 years. But it also meshed well with, frankly, the Sunni-Shia exhaustion in what had been really 2 years of sectarian civil war, focused in what you remember used to be called the triangle, Sunni triangle, Salah ad-Din, Nineveh province, and Anbar, but what a price to pay.
Ambassador Ted Kattouf, who's enlightened us enormously, and Stuart Bowen, who's brought this enormous knowledge of what went right and wrong in Iraq. And thank you also for being here and for being a good audience and for asking some tough questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.